All right, kids, are you ready to hear a story? Yeah.
Welcome to Witch Toast and Other Tales. This story is called The Mysterious Flower. Once upon a time, there was a man named John hiking in the Amazon. John was with a group, and they had a guide, and they were on a months-long journey through one of the most remote and difficult-to-travel parts of the jungle. Each day they'd travel, investigating anything that looked interesting along the way, and then make camp. Well, one day, after traveling quite a few miles and seeing a waterfall and a cave, they made camp as they did, and John had to go to the bathroom. So he walked off a little ways from the camp and relieved himself. When he was heading back, his eye caught something off to the side. What was that? He moved closer and saw that it was a clearing, maybe 30 feet across. And right in the middle of that clearing, the only thing in it was a large plant, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. It had a thick stalk and broad, squarish leaves, about the size of a piece of paper. And right at the top was a flower bud. The bud was massive, at least a foot across and just as tall. John had never seen anything like it, and he went over to get a closer look. He reached out to touch a leaf, but just as his hand got close, the guide shouted, "John! John!" And the shout startled him. His hand jerked and scraped along the edge of a leaf. He felt a sharp pain and winced, and looked down at his hand. There's a small cut, but it really hurt. It felt kind of like a paper cut. He shouted back to the guide, "I'm coming!" Then he left the clearing and headed back to camp. When he went to bed that night, he had trouble falling asleep. The cut on his finger was really bothering him. He hoped it wasn't going to get infected. Eventually, he did fall asleep, and when he did, he had strange dreams. In one of them, he was wandering through a dense fog. He couldn't see anything, but there's a sense of ominousness and confusion. And then he heard a woman cry out and a dog barking. And the sounds came from a particular direction, so he turned and went that way, searching. All at once, he found himself in a clearing, about 30 feet across, where there was no fog. And in the middle of that clearing, he saw something familiar, the same flower he'd seen earlier that day. Except the flower bud on this one wasn't closed. It was open, and it was beautiful. The petals were a dark blue velvet with sparkling silver veins running all over them. And right in the middle of the flower, there were 2 big pearls, as big as his fist. One was white and iridescent, seemed almost to glow. The other was a deep, dark black, so black it was almost like a hole in space. He walked over and reached out his hand to touch the white pearl. But just as his fingers got close, he woke up. The full moon was right above him, shining down straight into his eyes. He blinked, confused. Hadn't he just been having a dream? He couldn't quite remember, but he definitely had to pee. So he climbed out of the hammock, and he pushed aside the mosquito netting. Then he walked off into the woods. And when he had finished, he started walking back towards camp. And once again, his eye caught the edge of the clearing he'd visited earlier. And it was then that the memory of the dream came back to him. He didn't want to linger in the jungle, not at night, but decided to check it out, to take another peek at the flower real quick. So he walked over and stepped into the clearing. He gasped, and his jaw dropped open. The flower had bloomed. It wasn't quite like in his dream. The petals weren't blue with silver thread, but bright red with crimson lines. And in the middle were the pearls. Well, they weren't exactly the same either. There were 2 large spherical objects. They sort of looked like large walnuts. He went over to get a closer look. And yep, they really did look like walnuts, or maybe pecans. They must be seeds. He reached out and grabbed hold of one, then gave it a gentle tug. Came away easily. Then he did the same with the second and put them both in his pocket. He left the clearing, returned to camp, put the seeds in his backpack, and went back to sleep. Over the course of the rest of the trip, he had many adventures and saw many strange and awesome things. By the time he boarded a boat for home, he had all but forgotten about the flower and its seeds. That journey was long too, and had its own adventures. But eventually, John did return home. He was unpacking his backpack a day or two later when he came across the seeds. He recalled the flower and thought that someday he might try to grow one, but he was a busy man and his flat had no garden, not that he was much of a gardener. So he put them in a box in the closet and soon forgot about them. A few years went by. John's career took off and he got a little older. He decided to take a step back and semi-retire. And he decided as well to move out of the city, out of his flat, and to buy a house in the countryside. He found a beautiful Victorian home near a brook. It sat on 12 acres, came with a barn, and attached to the house was a large greenhouse. Well, he fell in love with the place and bought it and moved in. And in the course of moving in, he came across the box he'd put into his closet all those years before, the box with the seeds. Once he'd fully moved in and successfully grown a few other plants in the greenhouse, he decided he was ready to try to grow one of them. He opened the box and pulled one out. Then he got a large pot, anticipating that the plant might reach the size of the one he saw in the jungle, placed the seed inside. Every day he watered it, and for 2 months nothing happened. At first he was kind of discouraged, but then, perhaps because he was a bit bored and a bit lonely, working less now and living outside the city, he got determined. He got resolute. He went to the library and found temperature and humidity charts for the jungle where he found the seed. Then he bought a thermometer and hygrometer and made adjustments to the greenhouse to make it match the jungle environment a little more closely. And every day when he watered the seed, he spoke to it, words of comfort and encouragement. He was beginning to think he really should get a dog, especially when he found himself talking it over with a seed that wouldn't sprout. When one morning, to his surprise and delight, he saw a little green shoot poking out of the soil. The plant grew fast, and as it did, the attention he paid it only grew greater. It was very strange. Unlike any other plant he'd grown or seen, its leaves were broad, their edges sharp. If he wasn't careful, they would leave little red lines on his fingers that bled and hurt like paper cuts. The leaves themselves would curl and bend, and even fold in strange ways. Sometimes they would be all curled and folded, and the leaves would look like the leaves of other plants in the greenhouse, though he dismissed this as most likely a product of his imagination. He supposed it might be some sort of defense mechanism for the plant to look like others in the jungle, perhaps plants that were poisonous or undesirable to eat. Something about the plant brought him a sense of calm and relaxation. Perhaps it was just the joy grown something so strange and wonderful. Sometimes he would open the windows and let the breeze flow through the greenhouse, and then the leaves of the plant would rustle much more loudly than the other plants in the greenhouse, probably on account of their large size, and there's something pleasant about that sound, like a sweet and gentle whisper. Over the next year, the flower grew and grew till it was about 5 feet tall, with a great big flower bud at the top. It was looking real similar to the one he'd seen in the jungle, and he couldn't wait for it to bloom. One night, after a nightcap and a few pages of a good book, he went to bed, and as he passed by the greenhouse, he saw the moonlight streaming in through the glass roof. He went inside and looked up. The full moon hung there. He looked at the plant and smiled, remembering that it was a similar night all those years ago when he'd gotten the seed which begot the plant. "Good night," he whispered to the plant as he passed it, and he smiled. Then he got in bed and fell asleep. John sat upright in the middle of the night. What was that? Something had woken him. He listened. Nothing. So he quietly got out of bed and walked cautiously through the house. But he didn't see anyone. Then he went into the greenhouse. He gasped. The jungle flower was gone, and one of the side window panes was broken. That's how the thief must have gotten in. But who would steal a flower? And it was the strangest thing, because it looked like the glass had been broken out from the inside. He reported the theft, and the police investigated, but they couldn't find anything. Not that the theft of a plant was a big deal for them, but the break-in was. The loss of the flower upset John, partially because he felt less safe in his home, knowing someone had broken in and was still out there, but also because he had grown quite attached to it and missed it. After a few months, he decided to try planting the second seed. So he got it out of the box from the top of the closet and he planted it in a big pot. And soon the plant sprouted. Should have brought a smile to his face, but something about it was unsettling. The first plant had brought him peace and joy, so he wasn't sure why things were different now. Perhaps it was the memory of losing the first plant. Even so, he watered the new one and spoke to it each day and cared for it, just as he had the other. And it grew just as quickly, if not more so. Well, one day he went to the park just down the road. He was walking on a trail, enjoying the sights and the beautiful day, when a little dog went running past him. A cute, fluffy little white dog, dragging a leash attached to its collar. And then he saw this woman running after it, shouting, "Sparky! Sparky!" He ran after the dog and grabbed the leash. The woman came over to him, and by the time she got there, the dog was jumping on him and licking his face. It was a very friendly dog. The woman said, "Oh, thank you so much." And John said, "No problem, miss, here you go." And he handed her the leash. Now, she was a rather attractive young woman, and they got to talking. And long story short, one thing led to another, and by the end of the month, he and Clarabelle were regularly going on dates. Meanwhile, the second flower continued to grow and reached the same size that the other flower had been when it was stolen, the same size as the original flower that he'd found in the jungle. And just like them, it was capped with a massive flower bud, which he was eager to see open. One week, Clarabelle had made plans to go with a couple of her girlfriends on holiday down the coast. Her elderly neighbor usually watched Sparky, but the last minute he got sick, so John offered to watch the little dog. From their first meeting, Sparky had always been friendly, if a little boisterous about it, and John was looking forward to the company while Clarabelle was out of town. So Friday afternoon, he stopped by Clarabelle's and picked up Sparky. They chatted for a bit, and then John said goodbye and went home. That evening, he took Sparky for a walk and gave him dinner. Then John sat on the couch to a good book, and Sparky jumped up into his lap and curled into a ball. And when it came time for bed, Sparky was close behind him, and John fell asleep with a smile on his face, and Sparky snuggled against his leg. But when morning came, Sparky was gone. John figured he'd gone to explore the house, so he set about looking for him, but Sparky was nowhere to be found. As John searched, he became increasingly frantic. Every window was locked, every door shut. But the little dog, where had he gone? John checked the greenhouse too. This was the only place where he found signs that Sparky had been there. There was dirt on the floor with paw prints in a couple of places. Maybe Sparky had gotten to a bit of digging. John went outside and searched his property, calling out Sparky's name. Then he went to the neighbors and asked them if they'd seen the little white dog, but nobody had. John searched all day. And when dusk came, he returned home, crestfallen and exhausted. Where had Sparky gone? Could Clarabelle ever forgive him? He hadn't even managed to keep Sparky safe for a single night. With a heavy heart and troubled mind, John lay down and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, he woke and sat upright. What was that? Something had woken him. Could it be Sparky? He sat still and listened, but heard nothing. He was tempted to call out for Sparky, but something didn't feel right. The night was eerily familiar. Moonlight streamed through the windows, and a full moon hung in the sky. And John remembered what happened the last time he was awoken by a mysterious sound in the middle of the night. He quietly searched the house, but found nothing. Then he headed for the greenhouse. To his relief, the giant plant was still there, its flower buds still closed. There was a little dirt around the base of its planter. Hadn't he cleaned that up? No matter. Dirt was always spilling on the floor. It was a greenhouse, after all. He made his way around the other plants, inspecting the windows. He reached the end of the greenhouse and breathed a sigh of relief. Nothing was amiss. But no sooner had he let himself relax than there came a sound from the other end of the greenhouse, like something scraping across the floor. He ran that way and saw to his shock that the plant was gone. The pot was still there, but the plant was not. Had someone gotten in? Had someone cut the plant down and run off with it? Had they been hiding in the shadows when he came this way before? Where were they now? And all of a sudden, something wrapped around his ankle. He looked down. It was a vine? Then it jerked hard. pulled him down. He fell to the floor with a crash and turned, trying to quell a rise in panic to see where the vine was coming from. It was the plant. It had bloomed. There it was behind him. It had long tendrils like vines. That is what had grabbed his ankle, what held him still, what was dragging him back towards the center of the flower where there was a great and vicious-looking mouth. John tried to drag himself away, but the plant was strong, and he began sliding across the floor as it drug him towards its mouth. Blood was running down his ankle. He reached out for something, anything. His hand found the bottom of one of the tables, the low table that the plant had been sitting on before. Good thing it was bolted to the floor. As the plant tried to drag him backwards, he grabbed the top of the table and pulled himself forward and up. He reached for the far end of the table, but just then the vine jerked him back and he missed. He desperately reached out again, and his hand dove into the pot. But instead of just soil, he found a stump. And he realized it must be the stump of the plant, or perhaps you should say creature, that was trying to eat him. He felt another pull of the vine, but he kept his grip on the stump, and as he slid backwards off the table, the roots and the stump of the plant came with him out of the pot. As the roots emerged from the soil, he saw to his shock and horror a white ball of fluff trapped among the roots. Sparky. As he hit the floor, he reached out and felt Sparky. He was warm. John realized Sparky was still alive, and he saw that the roots didn't just hold Sparky. Some of the little ones actually went into him. For whatever reason, this made John furious. It enraged him. He grabbed one of the roots that went into Sparky, broke it off, and when he did, he felt the plant shudder through the vine. He broke off another, and the plant shuddered again, so he just kept breaking them. And as he did, the grip on his ankle grew weaker. When he'd broken off the last root that ran into Sparky, he looked back, and the plant was curling up on itself. John reached out and picked up Sparky. He could feel a faint heartbeat through the small dog's thin sides. He stood up and staggered out of the room, and he set Sparky down on the couch. He was steady on his feet now, and as quickly as he could, he got an aerosol can and a lighter and returned to the greenhouse. He approached the plant, still curling up and writhing on the floor. John flipped the lighter and shot a stream of aerosol through it. The plant quickly caught fire, and as it burned, it gave off a strange sound, a high-pitched tremolo that pierced his ears. But he didn't stop. He burned it. He burned it until it was ash. And then John went to the roots and burned them until they were ash too. And then he picked up all the ashes in a metal shovel and he dumped them in the fire pit outside. And he burned them again for hours and hours. He even dumped the soil from the pot into the pit and soaked it with gasoline and lit it on fire. All night long a fire raged in that fire pit. When morning came, John headed inside and took a look at his ankle. Hurt terribly. It was covered in thin, red lines like 1,000 paper cuts. He cleaned it with soap and water, then bandaged it up. Over the next week, Sparky recovered remarkably. By the time Clarabelle returned, the little dog was a little more tired than usual, but otherwise seemed just fine. John didn't say a word about what had happened, not to Clarabelle or to anyone else. Who would believe him? Not too long after Clarabelle returned from her vacation, John decided the time was right. He visited a jeweler, made reservations at a fancy restaurant, and invited Clarabelle for an evening on the town. As they talked over dinner, he marveled at how beautiful she looked, her emerald eyes smiling into his over a gown of shimmering green. When dinner was winding down, he said, "Close your eyes. I have something for you." "Ooh, a surprise," she said, and closed her eyes. "All right, now open them," John said. When she did, he was down on one knee holding a jewelry box with a beautiful diamond ring. Her hands flew to her mouth and her eyes welled with tears. He asked her to marry him, and she said yes. He stood, and they embraced for the first time. John walked Clarabelle home afterwards and said goodbye. He hesitated, then reached for her hand. They were engaged now, after all. Squeezed it. She squeezed back and smiled warmly. He felt a sharp prick, but ignored it, caught up in the moment. After she had gone and shut the door, he looked down at his hand, which still stung a little. There was a thin red line that hurt worse than it looked. Just like a paper cut. The end.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe.